Q&A Stitch With Me session from the full coverage mini-series. I have to put it out there, I have received so many lovely comments. And I'm so pleased that this series has actually helped some people out there. You put this content out onto something on platforms such as YouTube where, you know, it's floss tube specific, and you wonder whether, one, is it going to make any sense? Two, is anyone going to be really interested and watch it? And I'm so pleased that I did, because I was a bit undecided when I first started doing the series of whether it was worth doing, given that I was that new person. You know, how much value am I going to offer to anyone that watches these videos? So the wonderful comments that I got, I am so thankful that you've reached out to me and you sent me those comments to let me know that it was actually wanted and it has actually helped some of you out there. But also, I did say to you, if you have any questions or you've got any problems, reach out to me. Put the comments in the messages below and I would do a Q&A session. So today I am here to do your Q&A session. I left it for a while in the hope that it would allow everyone the opportunity to watch the series from start to finish and then come to me with their questions, so that I didn't sort of like do a Q&A too soon. So it's literally 20 to 8 at night. I've just got in from work. The kiddly winkies are off to the gym, so that's one lot of noise gone. The husband is away. That is my second most biggest amount of noise that will be gone. I'm going to go and get in my very comfortable clothing, sit down with my stitching, and we will do a Stitch With Me, and I will cover as many of the questions as I can in the short amount of time that we have. If we run out of time, then we'll just have to do another one. But hopefully I should be able to plow through the questions whilst I'm stitching. So I will be right back and I will be with you very soon. Okay, as you can see, here we are with the stitching. And I'm going to try to answer the questions and stitch at the same time, which for me is a task all unto itself, because I tend to find that I have to concentrate a lot more on my stitching when I try and talk, so this could get rather interesting. But we're gonna try and do. I'm going to try and do my best and answer questions and stitch. If I fail miserably, I might just quit the stitching and just sit and talk to you, because I'm not 100% sure that I can focus myself on the stitching and try and talk at the same time, because it's only the professionals that can do that. Okay, right, let me just get this started, this thread started, and then we can. Okay, there we go. Oh. Right, so I've tried to break the questions into little sections. So we've got sections on threads. What else have we got? We've got sections on techie stuff, sections on storage and systems, section on fabric, a section on other, and I think that's it. So there's a lot of questions, so I'm going to try and answer as many of these as I can, and hopefully we'll get to the end of them before my time is up, because I'm actually doing this before I'm due to start work, because I'm working from home today. So you have the pleasure of my company at such an early time in the morning, but you don't know that, because you won't see this until a lot later. Okay, so questions. So there are some questions on here that even I was a bit like, I'm not 100% sure what they mean. So I will try and answer the questions with what I think you wanted to know. If I've got it wrong, and that's not the question you was asking, send me another question. And if you can sort of say, that wasn't what I asked for, Teresa, what I meant was, because I've tried to sort of just print these off and understand what it is that I'm being asked. So yeah, I'm rambling. See, it's already started. The rambling has started. So let's see how we do. So the first question was, someone has sent me a question saying that they've now got all their threads, of which includes Krynic or Krynic, however you say it, Will you be showing the best way to stitch with this thread too? So because my chart doesn't have Kreinik or Kreinik in it, I can't really show you. I have got projects that I'm working on that do have it. So when I do a stitch with me on one that's got some Kreinik in it, then obviously you'll see how I stitch with it. But basically, the way that I do it is, because it's a sparkly thread, I literally do it the same way as I'm doing it with a single strand cotton. Just because you only really ever, because it can be a bit, it's not the smoothest. I just use it as a single strand. I make my strand a little bit shorter so that it's not too long. Hold on, I've got to count. See, we're counting. Okay, so where are we? 1. So square. That's it. So yeah, so I'll make it sort of a half a length of what I would normally stitch with, and I would do it as a single strand. And I normally start my Kreinik thread exactly the same as you're seeing me start these strands. I mean, some people do a waist away knot. Like I said, if you look up how to start a single thread, you'll have lots of different options and ways to start a thread. And with the Kreinik, it's exactly the same. There's nothing amazingly different about it, apart from the fact that it can be a little bit more tricky. So we always just use it in a shorter length and go, you know, don't drag it through the fabric really quickly. I tend to be a little bit more careful, not amazingly careful, but a little bit more careful with it. 894. 894. What's next? So next, now I got a comment on here saying you might want to mention in the next one about what to do if it has multiple skeins for one colour. I'm not 100% sure what you mean. Obviously, part of going through the your floss section of your chart, and I told you it told you on there, based on 25 count 2/1, how many skeins of floss you would need. So obviously full coverage, sometimes you can use a little bit more, but for me it doesn't really work out like that, because obviously the floss allowance is based on the Heaven and Earth design. The floss allowance is based on it's based on 25 count 2 strands of floss, like doubled like this, over 1 square. So depending on what fabric you've gone with, and whether because obviously I'm using 25 count, but I'm not using 2 strands. I'm doing 1 strand. So obviously that halves the allowance, but then obviously I'm parking, so then I give it just a bit more, because obviously I'm dragging my thread down the back of my work. But in saying that, I don't really drag very far. If it's not in the next square or 2 down, I'll end the thread. So it's not like I'm going, right across the fabric, so therefore using a lot of the thread. Again, like I said before, I tend to find that unless it says I need like 3, 4 or 5 skeins, I'll only order 1 skein, because by the time I start getting to the bottom of a skein, I'll know that I'll need to order another one. And that way you only actually order what you need, rather than just ordering what it says and then find that in actual fact, because you've changed the number of threads that you're using, or you've changed the fabric size. Hang on, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah. Because I've changed what it is, obviously the requirement for how much floss will change. So yeah, again, I think it's just down to, you know, how you want to kit it up. I tend to find that because these projects are so big and they have so much thread on them, and the likelihoods of you getting to the point that you're going to need another skein straight off. I mean, you might be really like to be a much more organised person than me, in which case you'll order exactly what it says. And that way, if you've got any leftovers, then they'll just go back into your stash, ready for the next project. So there is that option. What's next? Now I know all about the different ways. Please don't sigh. When you have small leftover pieces, where do you put them? Okay, so say for instance, I've got, you know, some of my threads here are really quite long because obviously my thread was originally based on a, I was doing this in 2-strand and then decided actually I don't want 2-strand. So you can see my lengths are really quite long. So when I'm finishing a thread on my lovely Annie's Keepers, I'll cut the thread colour because obviously I'll know what symbol on what colour I've been using, and I'll put it back onto, I'll just loop it back into here and have a single strand on here. As you can see, I haven't put any back on this one. Let me see if I can find you one. So if I've got a long enough thread that I can warrant doing it, then I will put a thread back on. If not, then I will just throw it away. I'll put it in an alts jar because I do have like an alts thing, like a little jar for all my little bits and pieces. So yeah, I mean, I haven't got any on here because obviously the way this pattern's been so far. But basically, because obviously there's a nice big hole here, what I'll do is if I've got a substantial length, I will literally just put the loop through here and catch it, and then I'll use that little bit going forward so that way I'm not wasting too much thread. So it would go on now. If I get to one in a minute where I need to do that, then I can show you. So there isn't really that much wastage. It'll go back onto it'll go back on there. So the next question. A skein isn't necessarily the same thing as floss. Yarn also comes in skeins. Wikipedia seems to think that a skein is a unit of measure equal to 360 feet. In the yarn world, skein indicates shape, not length. A skein of yarn is similar to a ball of yarn but oblong. Skeins of yarn come in various lengths. Thank you for that. Someone wanted to make sure that you understood skein doesn't necessarily, or isn't necessarily, the same thing as floss. They are correct, but when we're talking about skeins of thread, I'm talking about skeins of floss. But that is a very interesting thing to know, just for the record, for those that need to know. So for a project with say 90 colours, how do you organise them for easy access when you're stitching? I'm relatively like you, a chair and a stand, so no good place to really put them. I tend to put these next to me or on me. I'm interested to know how you keep all your park threads out the way, needle minders maybe, or just push them aside. Various ways. So I sometimes have what's known as scroll bar covers on my scroll bars, which basically are little covers that go over these. Hold up, let's move this. They go over these bits, and it basically goes on the top and on the bottom. When I've got those on, I will use those to sort of contain the thread. If not, I'll use needle minders. If not to that, I'll just push it out the way like I am now because I just didn't have anything to hand. The other way is to use hair clips. So I'll roll this up like this, and then I'll just get a hair clip and I'll hair clip that there out the way, which will just keep it out the way. But I tend to find that I don't really need to do anything with it personally. Oh, hello Fudge. Fudge needs to pop out, so, well, the Fudge is making my life a little difficult. I am sort of running out of time here, people, to do this video because my dog is being a pain in the bum. But hey, you gotta love him. Okay, so where was we? So yeah, keeping threads out the way. Basically, needle minders work, hair clips work. If you've got scroll frame covers or you've got grime guard covers, you can tuck them into there to keep them out the way. I basically use whatever's to hand. No hard and fast rules, just whatever is available. Don't necessarily think you need to sort of spend lots of money on it, but for those that sort of really get into it, you'll find that there'll be something that really sort of is the perfect thing for you. So when you find what that is, then that's what you roll with. Hold on, the dog wants to sit with me now. The dog is now sitting behind me, Mummy, just to make it more difficult. You gotta love them. And just so that you know, I'm working off of an iPad at the moment, so every now and then I'm marking my chart on my iPad. I did a video of how I use the GoodNotes app and how I got my charts into the GoodNotes app. So for me, for parking, it's perfect. I know that there's this new all singing, all dancing pattern keeper, which is for Android only. So there's a lot of people going out and buying their Kindle Fires and other Android products so that they can use it. I personally, because I'm parking, I don't necessarily think it's of much help to me. I think it's more help for cross-country stitchers. Unless, of course, you're one of these people that just really loves to track how many stitches you've done, because that's the other thing that it does. It tells you how many stitches you've stitched and how many stitches you've got left to go. So, okay, so I'm going to cut this here because this is an ending thread. What I'm going to do, so I know what symbol I was working on, so this is how I work out how to put it back. So that symbol that we was just working on was symbol 386. So let me get to my 386. Okay, so here we are. 386, that can't be right, was it? 386? Check again, Teresa. 3862. Okay, so that colour that we was just working on is this colour here, 3862. So I've ended the thread, which is still on the needle, so I'll take this off the needle, fold it in half, and then if I show you how I do this, so literally 3862, so I thread it up through my needle, keeper, Annie's keeper, God, you can tell it's early in the morning, can't you? Grab its tails, and literally I will just put that on there like that, so that when I get to it again, I can just go on there and grab that thread back off. But that way it's still saved, it's still on there, it's not just sort of hanging around somewhere and I've got to try and remember what it was. So that is how I get it back onto my Annie's keeper if I've got like a substantial amount left that I've ended on a thread. There's a couple of things that I'm a bit concerned about, and that's grid lines. How on earth do you do all that staggering? Well, I'm doing the staggering as we speak. It's exactly what I'm doing. So let me just start this thread. So the staggering basically is just the way that I work myself through my chart on my page. So I don't necessarily stagger pages, but I will stagger the squares or the blocks within a page. When I get to a page finish, I normally do a full page finish. But a lot of people still worry about their tension. so they don't want to do a finish on a page, so they'll carry on staggering, which again, it's all personal preference. There is no hard and fast rules here, but for this, when they're talking about the grid lines, so when they're talking about sort of these, the lines that they're talking about, so let me try and explain. So say for instance this bit here, if I was to have stitched, because that's the marker for the 10 block, so obviously it's come down like this. Now if I'd have just stitched this as a column and I'd kept going, and then I come back up to the top and then I started stitching another column, there's a possibility, it doesn't happen to everyone, it really is dependent on tension and your threads, how tight you pull your threads. There is for some people like a grid line that will show, like where it's a defined line where you can see like a dip and then it goes back up. I don't get that. One, I think mainly because I stagger. So I started in this square, this 10 by 10 square here. And then I go over and I do this 10 by 10 square here. But then instead of going across the top, because that would then create a column or a line along here, I'll then come down to this one. So then I would have had this square, and this square. And at that point, that's where my stagger starts. So I then have the choice that I can start here and go there, there, and there. Or I could go here, there, and there. Now, I finished this one. This was my last square that we just worked on. So then I had the choice. I could either start underneath and do a square there, a square there, a square there, and then do this square. Or I can go back up to the top, start all my new threads in this square, and start doing this square, that square, that square, and that square. But all I do is I stagger my blocks on my page until I get to a page finish. Now, for some people, they will park their threads over onto the next page. Sometimes that can help with the stopping of lines, because obviously you're continuing a thread rather than stopping a thread and starting all new threads. Again, no hard and fast rules, people. None whatsoever. You can end your threads. So yeah, you can carry on parking threads like this in the page below if you want to, or you can finish your threads on the page finish and start all new threads for your next page. It's completely personal preference. I've tried both ways, and for me personally, I haven't ever had grid lines based on doing that. But everybody will get a different experience. It's really to do with tension, I think, in the threads. I find that by parking, it sort of eliminates it anyway, for me. But like I say, that won't necessarily be for everyone. I think it's trial and error. Hang on, 3858, 3858. So yeah, so I tend to find that I will stagger my blocks, as you can see that I'm doing, until I get to a page finish, of which I'll do a full page finish so that I get the satisfaction of a page finish. And then I start all over again for the next page, and then start the stagger from the first square on that page rather than carrying on the staggers. But that's not to say that you can't carry the staggers. You could carry the staggers over onto a page, so that if you say, for instance, this was the end of page 1, then you could start a stagger on page 2 here, then go back to page 1 and do this one and this one and this one, if you see my point. But the staggering of the pages, I find, is what actually makes sure that I don't get any type of grid line showing where there's been a hard finish on a line and then you've not gone back to it for a while, or the thread tension is different. But I also think that by parking threads, in that helps alleviate it as well, because a lot of it is the pulling of the fabric, the pulling of the fabric, and then obviously the pulling of the threads is what can cause those grid lines. So I've always found that because I'm parking my threads, even though I'm parking underneath, I tend to find that by parking my threads and then picking them back up further down the page, sort of has a tendency to sort of change the way that the pull is on the fabric. But I'm not particularly, I don't tug my thread. I'm not what I'd call a tight stitcher. I don't stitch very tightly. Hence the reason probably why I like 1/1 on 25 count rather than 2/1 on 25 count. Because I think if you stitch with big tension, now I've got a knot in my thread. If you stitch with quite a tight tension, obviously 2/1 on 25 count won't look loose and floppy like mine does. It will be like really quite tight. Well, obviously, because that's what it is. So yeah, so again, I think it's just all on personal preference, but everyone will have a different experience. You'll have some people that will stitch and they'll get grid lines because of the way that they stitch, and you'll have other people that don't. I'm one of the people that, well, by doing the stagger, I tend to find that that's never something I've had to worry about. Okay, park him. Okay, so what's next? Now, I'm not 100% sure about this question. What does this say? So, I start at the top, I start at the top left down to bottom right. So let me see if we get this right. Top left, down to bottom right, okay. Up through right hole and down bottom left. So hence when I start anything, I start in the bottom left and corner of my chart, not my top left like everyone else. So my question is, would I start in the top left part of my chart, or can I still start my bottom left part of my chart? And would I still be able to part my threads without the threads hanging funnily? Sorry if this sounds like a random question. I don't think it's a random question. I think it's a very valid question. So the only difference is obviously then, because you start in your top left of every square. So yes, of course you can start your chart in the bottom left hand corner and work your way up the page this way. The only difference is, instead of having like what we do, where you've got threads that are sitting in holes ready to go like this, the only difference is you're going to park your thread slightly differently to us. So we park our thread below the stitching. As you can see here, it all hangs this way, and it's parked in the bottom left hand corner ready to start the stitch. All you're going to do is park your threads above your stitching, so you'll be parking upwards. So if you start in your bottom left hand corner of the chart, so say for instance this is the bottom of the chart and this is the bottom line, you will start your corner here, you will do this square working in the system that you've always stitched, which by the sounds of it is you start in the top left, so top left into bottom right, up through right hole and down into bottom left. Is that right? Yeah. So then all you'd do is you would stitch your square, and when it comes to parking, you'll go to the next square, which for you will be the square up. But instead of parking in the bottom right hand corner, bottom left corner, you'll park in your top left corner. And then you hang your threads that way, or you can fold them back out. Once you've finished, You can fold them back over your stitching. You can put the threads wherever you want to. There's no hanging difference. I mean, if I wanted my threads to hang the other way, it's really where you push them. So if I did that, that's sort of one of the options. And then in which case, as you can see, you would have the threads out the way. But obviously mine hang into the square, yours might hang the other way around. It really is personal preference. You can put these hanging threads wherever you want and then use a needle minder to hold them there, out the way. But yes, you certainly can start your chart in your bottom left-hand corner. You'll just need to know what is your bottom left-hand corner page number and then start from that page, if that makes sense. I did go through the page numbers and how the charts look. So every chart is slightly different, and because the charts all have different number of pages, that will determine what your starting page is. So obviously you just won't start in page 1, you'll start in whatever page your bottom left hand corner is. So I hope that helps. Okay, so what's next? I'm doing a big Haid chart, which is a lot of pages. What is the best way to work the project? Straight across the top of the fabric or down the side and work across that way? Well, as you can see, I will work across the top and down at the same time until I get to a page. I don't think there is any best way of doing this. I certainly don't think that one way is better than another. I think it's personal preference again. You know, if you do a page, say for instance that's a page there. Say for instance I did this page here. And then I thought, you know what, I'm quite bored of doing this bit. But there's something over here that I quite like the look of. Then I'll go to this page here and start this page. But I might think, God, it's a bit dull over there and I quite fancy whatever's underneath. So I'll start under there. The only thing that I do tend to find is I will pretty much do what I've done here. What I do with my staggers in my blocks is sort of what I do with the staggers of the pages. I will stagger the pages as well. So if I've got something that's got, you know, pages and pages, then I would do, say this is page 1. This would be page 2. Then I'd go down and do this page down here, page 3. So I would stagger my pages. But some people just like to do the top and then work their way in rows of pages. Or they like to start at the top left corner. They'll do a page and then they'll go to the page underneath. Again, it's all personal preference. No hard and fast rules. It's whatever you like. There is nothing that says that you have to do it a certain way or that there is any better way than any other way. It's all really dependent on how you stitch, how you like to stitch. 3722. Let me get 3722. See, this is the only trouble with doing a Heaven and Earth design and trying to answer questions at the same time, because there's so many colour changes. It's not like a block of colour where I can just sit and talk. Okay, so if you park, right, let's see if I can understand this question. If you park a dark thread, say black, and stitch a lighter colour, say white, over the parked black thread, will the black show through? Also, do you use the parking method on a regular pattern that has colour that is sporadic throughout the chart? Or do you end the colour and start anew? I tend to park on most projects as long as it's... So, if, for instance, my Mirabilias, I'll use a type of parking for some of my threads just so that I'm not stopping and starting threads all the time. I've never really... I think because obviously 25 count and 18 count Adas, and full coverage, because it's full coverage, you don't need to worry about parking a black thread and then going over it with a white, and you won't see it. You won't see it through the back of the work. I have never, ever had that. And bearing in mind that my Faces of Fury had lots of black on there and lots of white on her, like for her hair, like up in her hair she had like feathers, and then obviously she's got really jet black hair. That was done on an 18 count Ada. You can't see, and because it's full coverage, because you're covering all of the fabric, you can't see when you've got a black thread that sits behind a white square, because obviously you're stitching that white square. So yeah, I've never had a problem parking black under white or white under black. I mean, if you did, you'd know there's a problem, because the fabric is white, and if we stitch on anything over the top of the white, if our coverage isn't enough, you can see through it. So as long as you've got good coverage, you won't see anything that's sitting behind the actual front stitching. The only time obviously that is different is when you're working on a non-full coverage piece, where you've got open spaces of fabric where you can see any thread that you run at the back. So on a full coverage, it doesn't matter what colour you are running at the back or what colour you're carrying your thread. Even if it is a black and you park that thread and then you stitch a white block over where that black thread is, you will not see it. Not if you've got good coverage of the fabric that you're using. It's never something I've had happen. And I don't think I've ever heard of anyone having that problem either. So yeah, never a problem. I've not found that to be a problem on any of the full coverage pieces that I've worked on. Hold on, we're parking again. All right, so 3, 1, 2, 3, and it's up 1. There we go. I didn't realise how long this is going to take to answer all these questions while stitching. So what's next? Are you trying to pierce the thread tail when you let it go to the back from the upper right corner? No, I'm not. I know that's how it looks, but I'm not. So let me get a thread. Hang on. What's the next colour? The next colour is 3860. So when I'm doing this, all I'm trying to do is bring the tail down as far as I can without going back through the hole, and then almost using the needle to just push the tail slightly out of the way, but not, because the idea is that by doing it the way that I do it with this single strand, let me see if I can demonstrate it. Okay, so let me zoom you in. So I'm bringing my tail down in my top right hand corner, and then I'll hold that tail out of the way and bring my start leg up here in its starting point. Now, if you can imagine looking at this from behind, it's in a full coverage piece. So unlike stitching, which is sort of just the odd stitch here and there, if you was to pull this thread down and then stick the needle back down, it's going to make it so that the thread is sort of almost like hanging out of the fabric. On full coverage, you don't really get that very much, because there's so many threads and fabric going on at the back. So when I'm doing this, I'm basically just wanting the tail to disappear back sort of down the hole, but it's not going to be floating around. It's still going to be sort of in its own situ. So then by me then doing my second leg of my cross, because all the threads at the back are all holding everything in place anyway, it's almost like it allows for me to catch my thread at the back. So it catches itself. So it's a bit like doing a cross, because it's not pushing the thread out the way, so that when I then bring the needle back down, it's not catching that thread. Most of the time it will catch that thread, which allows for me to do it this way. But I'm not specifically trying to sort of stab the towel. I don't know what happened there, but I think the camera switched off, so I don't know how much of this you've heard. So I'm just going to whiz through a few more of these questions, but without stitching, because I've got to a part where there's just lots of single stitches, and yeah, and I'm struggling to do two things at once. So let me grab my coffee. What does it say? So was I trying to pierce the thread towel when you're letting it go back down? Right, okay, so the single strand where I pierce the thread, no, I'm not trying to pierce the thread. I'm literally just trying to grab that little towel, push it to the back, but without pushing it too far out the way. And by being on a full coverage, the threads don't have the option to just waggle around at the back wherever they like, because obviously there's lots of threads sort of holding everything in situ. So I tend to find that by pushing my towel sort of just through the hole, it still sort of sits there, which means when I then complete my cross, it sort of catches over itself, if that makes any sense. So then I've got a question saying, everything was clear to me until the end. I'm just a bit confused as to how you progress. Do you try to do the top row first? Then maybe I do it myself. Maybe once I do it myself, it will make more sense. If you could explain that a little more. Right, you can sort of see how I do this. So I started here, and then I stitched the square next to it, but instead of then continuing in a line, I've gone down. And then I'm gone back up here, or down here, and stitch back up, and then back down. So you can go up and down in a diagonal sort of stagger, or you can just sort of just stitch down, or you can just stitch up. And then what I'll do is I'll get to a full page finish my page finish, and then I'll decide, right, do I want to go to the right and start another page, or do I want to go down and start that page? That makes sense. Hope that helps. Next question. I'm curious about ending without flipping my work. It seems that I've seen a method where you trowel off to the right, maybe more than 10 squares, and then you clip the extra. Yeah, so basically it's what I've done here. So this little towel here basically is an ended thread. So some people don't want to flip their work, which is obviously what I tried not to do whilst I was talking to you. So the way that this works, I personally don't do it because I find that it just looks messy and it gets on my nerves, but it is a great way to work without having to flip. So basically when you're going to end a thread, you'll make an ended thread slightly smaller than you would, you know, of any of your parking threads. And you would always go sort of a number of stitches across. So for me, I've gone like another 20 stitches, or 30 in total. So if it's parked in this square here, I won't put it in the first two blocks. It will go in, say, the third block. And then I'll park it and I'll leave it just with a little towel, because that's a denominator that actually that's not a parked thread. That is a towel. So then the theory of how the towel, parking the towels works is if you end your threads to the right and you park your threads underneath, you'll always know that everything that's got a small little towel will be over to the right, and anything that's parked that's got longer towels or longer strands of thread is your parking thread, so you can't get confused. Never try and park in the same area that you're going to leave your ended thread towels if you're going to try and do this method. Always make sure that you either park your thread to the right and your towels underneath, or vice versa, like I've done. But at no point would I be ending towels in the same direction that I have parked threads, because it would become very confusing and very messy. So the way this tends to work is you always go at least 2 squares away to end the threads. Then once you stitch, so say for instance, every thread here that I ended over here, like this one. And then obviously I'd stitch down. Those towels would stay there, and you do the same as you're going down. When you get back up to here, you would then stitch this square here fully, which then would cover this towel thread, which is running behind these 2 squares. By the time I'd got to end in this square, I would then snip this towel at the front, because obviously it's all been covered by the stitching on the back on this square. I hope that makes sense. And then obviously if I've got something in this square that I'm going to end a thread, instead of parking it in here and ending the thread, I would put the thread in here and end a thread. So each time you'll just move further along, so that at all times you'll always end up with a nice chunk of spare square to stitch over the towel at the back, which then allows you to cut this towel off. So that is what you are referring to. There's, again, no hard and fast rules. You know, if you decide that you're parking your threads to the right, you could end your threads underneath. If you do it like me and you park your threads underneath, you can finish your towels to the right. Okay? So next question. How do you keep the parked threads from tangling whilst working nearby? There's a number of different ways. Sometimes, like I said, I'll use my scroll bar covers and just pull them down out the way like so. Other times I'll use a needle minder, and other times I just let them go rogue. But I don't tend to find that they get very messy, because once I'm working on a section, so say for instance I'm going to work on this section, I'll divide it like you do like kiddie's hair, really, like so, and then I will move this little lot out the way and just play with these threads here. But you can use a hair clip. That's the easiest way. Most people I've seen use like little needle minders or hair clips, and they just clip the thread out the way so that it just keeps everything organised. Okay, I do have a question for you. How do you keep your leftover of your thread? Again, I've answered that. If the thread is too short, if like it's a, you know, yay big, I mean, that's still a substantial amount of thread, but obviously it's not something that I can put back on my thread keeper. I'll put that into what's known as an orts jar, which is basically a jar of all my little straggly leftovers. And then if I decide to do an ornament or a biscornu or a pin cushion, I'll stuff it inside so that it's, you know, goes to good use. And also I do tend to put my thread orts out on the garden, on the lawn for the birdies at the right time of year. So when I know that they're going to be building their nests, I will do that as well. What else have we got for you? I have a question for you regarding the quantity of thread recommendation on some, not all patterns. In your experience, do you think they give the correct quantity needed? Some show it in the actual yardage needed, some in the number of skeins. The reason I'm asking is, from what you've shown, most of the thread is behind the canvas. Do the pattern recommendations take this into consideration? So how much thread of each colour do you buy for your pattern? Looking forward to your next video. Okay, so parking is its own thing. You will tend to find that it won't necessarily cover the parking of the thread. So it might be slightly out. But then in saying that, so for instance, the Heaven and Earth floss coverage is based on a 25 count 2/1. So that's 2 strands over 1. Now obviously I don't do 2/1. So obviously I do 1/1. So I know that if it says 2/1 on 25 count, if I'm doing it 1/1 on 25 count, I have more than enough floss to do my parking method. Personally, I don't think the parking method is really that much different to cross country, because if you're a cross country stitcher, you would run the fabric and stitch all the stitches, and you would run as far as you need to. So again, you would end up wasting a lot of thread at the back by going around sort of finding the stitches. I really don't, I've never, well, let's put it like this. I've never got to a point where I've got to the end of a pattern with Heaven and Earth design and I run out of floss that I shouldn't have run out of. I think that's only if you don't save your ends when you end a thread. But then saying that, for cross-country stitchers, I don't really think they end threads that much. They sort of run their thread till it's ended. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure how to answer the question, because it really is just dependent on the method of stitching that you use. It's also dependent on the number of threads that you use, on the fabric that you use. But obviously the chart will tell you what the floss usage, or the floss usage allowance is for. So for me, it's a 25 count fabric, but their recommendation is you need that number of skeins for working 2 over 1. That's 2 threads over 1. So that's double the amount for what I'm using. So therefore I know that because I'm not folding my floss in half and using 2 strands, I've already got an extra half a length of skein of floss for each run, as an allowance for my full coverage and the fact that I run my fabric or my threads at the back. But then if you was a cross-country stitcher, you would have the same thing. You would have a lot of thread that runs at the back because you'd just be travelling around on the fabric finding your pieces that you're stitching on. So I think obviously the key to answering this question is it's dependent on what fabric you're going to use, what the floss usage says it's for, and then you adapting that to however you're stitching it. Okay, so the last one on thread. So the last one on thread says, when you end a thread, because there's no place to park that thread, what do you do with the cut piece? Do you put it back on the holder, or no matter what the length, just throw it out? So like I say, if the thread is sort of yay big, I don't know if you can see what I'm doing with my fingers, so if the thread is sort of yay big, then that will go in an aux jar, because that isn't a long enough piece of thread for me to warrant keeping. So if it's this long, that goes in the aux jar. Anything longer than that, that could be threaded up as a single strand and stitched on this, that will go back onto my thread holder and keeper. So we're now on to techie. See, we're rolling through it now that I'm not actually stitching. Do you make use of any particular digital application to track your stitching? Would be interesting to find out which one do you use. So tracking stitching, I don't actually track my stitching as far as the number of stitches I've got left on my chart or anything along that lines. I track my projects and everything in the Xstitch app, so that I have like a tracker for what projects I've got on the go and what threads I've got, what fabrics I've got. But I don't electronically or digitally track my number of stitches. I do have my little happy planner that will basically tell me how many days I've stitched on what projects, so that I know how many days I've stitched on each one. But that is the good old-fashioned pen and paper method. If you have a PDF version of a full coverage pattern, how do we mark the parked threads? What app do you use? So like I said, I know that the Pattern Keeper is out now. That is for Android. So anyone that's got a Kindle Fire or a Kindle or an Android type device, the Pattern Keeper is an option. I did get an opportunity to have a little look at the app up and running. And although it does look like a very, very good app, I don't think it's something that I could work with. The only reason I say that is because I use the parking method. So because I park my threads and I stitch block by block, the only real massive advantage I saw to the Pattern Keeper was that if you're a cross-country stitcher and you want everything in that colour on the whole chart, it will highlight it on the pattern for you, as well as obviously laying the pattern out so that it looks like a whole piece of paper rather than pages. But obviously because I work page by page and I work block by block within a page, I just use my usual GoodNotes app. I tend to find that that's perfect for me because I'm working in blocks. Okay, so as you can see, I've actually changed my my pattern. The idea is that this might be a little easier to stitch on whilst I'm talking to you. And whilst I was here, I thought I would show you how I use my... Obviously, I've done a demonstration with the Annie's Keepers. It makes sense whilst I'm doing this to show you the example of how I do it with my Paco thread organisers. And literally, the principle's the same. So I grab my needle and I give the thread a little tug and it comes straight out. It's as simple as. So it's exactly the same as what we just did with the Annie's Keepers, but obviously this is with a Paco thread organizer. The only upside to the Paco thread organizer is obviously it's got the symbols on there, so I don't need to keep referring back to the chart, which is what I'm going to do with my Annie's Keepers, is just put a sticker on with the symbol on it. But I thought, well, since I'm here showing you this, I might as well demonstrate it all in action at the same time. Now please bear in mind that when I'm stitching on this, I'm actually stitching this 10th stitch. This is not 1/1 25 count. This is 2/1 10th stitch, which is basically half cross, is how I'm doing that. But this one again is with a loop start, so it's very similar to what you've already seen before in my videos about the full coverage. She says if she can, why is that all stuck together? Come on. It's just doing it to spite me, look. Okay. We're going to be like that, aren't we? There we go. And literally I'm just doing the half cross. So it'll go a bit faster. And theoretically, because I've got loads of block colour down here, I know I haven't finished up here, but that's all lots of different coloured stitches, whereas down here is all block colour. So I thought this would be the ideal thing to be stitching on and answering the Q&A questions more so than the other one, because I obviously am not very good at multitasking with the trying to talk about something and stitch something else at the same time. Right, so back to the questions that you so kindly left me, people. And let's see whether this is a bit better than the last one where I was struggling to tell you or talk to you at the same time as stitching. So let me just... Okay, so the next question was... what other progress keepers are there for Android? I tried the new one you demonstrated, but it will not work for me as it won't recognise the pattern I've uploaded. I tried photo and then converting it to a PDF and also a direct scan as a PDF, still nothing. Can you help me? If the Good Notes app isn't working, but I don't understand why yours isn't working. I've never had a pattern that doesn't go into it. Like I said before, there are videos which I'll refer to about here to tell you the ones that I use, which I think is Good Notes and Dropbox, and how I get my pattern in from the Dropbox, and also how I use the Good Notes app. But there are a few other options. So if you head over to Crafty Lisa, she does a review and shows you how to use the Easy PDF app. I can't comment on it, I've never used it, but she uses it and she says that she gets on grand with it. And also for anyone that has Android only, as an alternative option is the new Pattern Keeper app. Again, I've not actually got working knowledge of it, apart from obviously whilst I was away this weekend, there were some lovely ladies that were using it. We uploaded a pattern and I had a little look at how it works. I can see why people are raving about it. However, I don't think it works for me and parking, because I park in blocks anyway. So there's no real cross-country stitching. But that's not to say that you couldn't use it for the same purpose. So yeah, for those that are, you know, keen to try something new, that is an option. But as to why you can't get yours into the Good Notes app, I really don't know. So next up, what was next? can I ask how you store your Annie's Keepers and Paco storage when they are loaded with all the hanging threads? Well, if they're loaded with all the hanging threads, the Paco organiser, these ones, Omanique, the ones that do the quantum frames, they do a Paco thread holder or stand for these. I've got the stand that holds 2. That's what I use for alternative reality. That's what I use when I'm working on this, although at the moment I've just got it sat on the side. For my Annie's Keepers, when they're hanging, obviously all the time that they're actually working on a project, again, if it's on a project, I will just have it by the side of me, and then when I'm not using them and they're actually just stock, if you like, just then I put them on the storage facilitators, and they go into an A4 drawer, which I will, if I can, take a picture of for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, 5. So yeah, again, when they're in use, I just have them sitting by my side when they're on a project, and then when they're no longer on a project and they're going back into stock, they'll go back onto the actual storage holders, and then they'll go in the drawer. Okay, so where are we going to put this? Let's put this over here. So that's me ending this thread. What was this one? How do you store the Paco with all the threads hanging after you're done stitching for the day? Like I say, when I'm done stitching for the day, because obviously I have like project bags, I literally just wrap round and stick them in the project bag like that, and they're perfectly fine. That's how I tend to deal with mine. What do you do to store the unused skeins once you are finished with it on the Paco? Do you store them on the Annie's Keepers or back onto bobbins? Since I've switched over to the Annie's Keepers, they all get stored back onto Annie's Keepers, and then they go into the storage, onto the storage things that basically hang in the drawer, which obviously I will show you a picture of. Okay, so I've just changed the thread. So next is, could you show how you use the Paco needle minder? I don't actually use the Paco needle minder because obviously I don't put my needles back. I don't have multiple needles, and obviously because the way that I use my Paco thread organisers, it is literally just to get new floss. It's not the Paco needle minder type system, I think is more for people that cross-country stitch or that are not parking their threads, because obviously when you park your thread, you wouldn't need another needle sitting on standby waiting. So yeah, I don't think that I could show you how to use. I mean, obviously I could show you how to use it in another video, but it wouldn't be something that I would use for a project. So I have one, but I have to be honest, I haven't used it. But I do know people that do, and they're more for the cross-country stitchers that are not parking threads. Obviously when you're parking threads, you don't need all those needles with floss attached to them, because it's already attached to the project, if you like, rather than having to keep changing the threads. Was wondering, does the Paco thread organizer come with multiple strips so that you can go on to your next project with the symbols related to the threads you are using next? I went to my local craft store and found out I will need to buy this particular organizer online. I'm learning a lot from your mini series. So yeah, when you order the Paco thread organizer, so when you get this, you will get a number of the cardboard sliders that go inside. So you don't just get one, you do get like multiples of those, so that you've obviously when you're done with one project, you would just throw that one away. Or the best thing about them is they're printed on both sides, so you basically get 2 lots of projects off of one strip, and I think you get, I don't know, maybe 20 strips with your Paco thread organizer, so plenty of strips to use with it. And then obviously if you wanted to, you could always, I don't know, get some white card piece and sort of draw around it and then cut your own if you've got a good pair of scissors. What else? Any chance you can show us how to load the holder with the floss, please? The Annie's Keepers, I think I've already done that in the review of the Annie's Keepers. The Paco thread organizer, it's literally you cut your thread to the size that you want it. So for instance, this project, let me buzz you out a bit. So this project here basically is 2 strands. So I'm doing a loop start. So all I will do is I will measure out my floss. She says if she can unravel it. So I'll measure out my floss. I will do my usual hand to elbow measurement or beyond, depends on how long you want it. Whatever it is, bearing in mind if you're doing 2 strands, it's whatever it is folded over. So for me, it's that length. And then literally, oh crap, I've pulled that off there and I can't remember which one it went off of. Maybe the video will show me. It will do, so it will show me. So literally all you do, you lower it over the loop, and then on this foam section you can see it's got splits in it, and you literally just push it in like so, and then you pick your thread from here or from down here, whichever, wherever your preference is. But that's basically how you load it. It's super easy to load. So that is it for the techie bits, she says. Well, it's all the questions that I've had for the techie bits. So moving on to the fabric. So the questions we got on the fabric was, most of the Aida I've used is pretty stiff. Do you know of a brand that isn't stiff? Not particularly is the answer to that. Most of the Aidas that I've tried do have an element of stiffness to them. I tend to find that I'm working on an Aida on a full coverage piece, because you're working on it a lot longer than you would on a small project. I tend to find that it just does soften up over time. The more I work on it, the softer it gets. Some are a little bit stiffer than others. But I've not actually found any that I can honestly say are nice and soft. I think they're all slightly stiff. But then it's a bit like this 25 count that I'm working on now. This is quite scratchy and quite stiff also. So, but again, you're going to be working on these full coverage for some time. I think it's only really sort of, if you know that you're working on something that's maybe you're not going to be stitching on it very long, then you might need to sort of, or you might want to think about something that's less stiff. But honestly, I've not really found, other than maybe some hand-dyed Aidas for non-full coverage, I don't think I've ever found sort of Aida that isn't just a little bit stiff to start with. But like I say, the more you work with the Aida, you tend to find that it softens with use, either whether it's being held or in a frame, just by literally sort of working with it, sort of makes it a little bit more pliable and a little bit less rough. That's my experience of it so far. But to be honest, I don't have that much experience of working with Aida. I worked on Aida for a short amount of time, went over to even weave and basically haven't looked back. I tend to find that I really do prefer the even weave personally. So the next one, so I got a comment saying, confused about the gridded fabric, do the lines wash out when you wash your project before framing? Yes. So basically these grids are actually pre-printed onto the fabric. So that way you've got constant grid lines on your fabric until you wash it. And all I do is I hand wash my projects at the end. I say it needs to be warm water. It needs to be like more than a bit warm. So you still need to be able to put your hands in it. So you don't want it like cooking. It's no good having boiling water. But it does need to be fairly warm. Like fairly warm on the old handy pandies. But I hand wash it in rather warm water, not lukewarm water. It needs to be hotter than lukewarm. With a little bit of detergent. I say, well, be careful people. Detergent over here isn't washing up liquid. It's like, so I just use some really soft, like fairy liquid, which is like a gentle fabric wash. I stick a little bit of that in, agitate it in the water for a little while, leave it to sort of soak for 5 or 10 minutes, rinse it all off, and by then all of the grid lines are gone along with all the dirt. And you'll know that because all of a sudden the water that was clear just looks horrid. You don't actually realise how dirty your stitching gets until you actually wash it. Well, it does in my case anyway. So what do I think about 28 count or 32 count? My personal preference when it comes to full coverage pieces is to stitch on 25. That's not to say that I don't like other fabric types. That's just my preference. I mean, even because obviously a lot of the projects that I work on, if it's not a full coverage, is a project that's normally on a hand dyed fabric. You tend to find that when fabric has been hand dyed, it makes the count smaller, if you like. It shrinks the fabric. So if if say for instance you ordered a 25 count and it was hand dyed, by the time it's gone through the processes of being hand dyed and then you go to stitch on it, it's actually probably closer to a 28 count than it is a 25 count, because obviously being a 25 count it would have bigger holes. But because it's been hand dyed and obviously the hand dyeing process and the washing, I don't know, it seems to shrink the fabric slightly. Not massively, it's not a huge difference, but for some fabrics you can really tell the difference. So my preference is always a 25 count or a 28 count. I do have some 32 count, but my preference is more the 28 count and the 25 count. But again, everyone is different. That's not to say that there aren't other projects that I'll stitch on that I'll use a higher count for. What else have we got? So Kate Liz says, I have some fabric. Tried test washing my test stitching. The grid lines did not come out. They didn't even fade. Is there a special soap I need? Thanks for making the videos. No, there's no special soap. The only thing that I would say is there is a possibility that maybe you haven't made the water warm enough. Don't be shy with how warm the water is. It does need to be fairly hot for the grid lines to come out. So if you've done it in what is considered to be lukewarm water, try making it a little bit hotter, because you tend to find that the pre-grid doesn't come out if the water's not warm enough. What else have we got? So I purchased a design that was calling for 32 count clay linen. So I tried to find some, no luck yet, but that leads me to the question of what are the type of fabrics and their quantities? Zweigart, are they just brands or totally different types of fabric? If I can't find the 32 count coloured linen, what should I do? So basically, obviously you've got your counts of fabric, which is your, your 32, your 28, your 25. Then you've got your other things. So you've got names such as Lugana and Zweigart, Brittany. They're all sort of branding more than anything. But certain brands will only do certain counts. So being that I like 25 count, I tend to find that most of my fabric that turns up is a Lugana. But you've got a Murano, is it? Maruno. You've got Brittany, you've got Jablin. So basically when they're talking about Zweigart and Lugana, Brittany, they're all brands, but like I say, depending on the brand will depend on what count of fabric you actually end up with. Some brands will only do a certain count. So if you know that you want a 25 count, then it may be that the brand that you're looking at, or the name of that brand that you're looking at, isn't a brand that does that size. It may be that they only do a 28 count, for instance. So all of those are just brand names, but again, the brands and the names do have some say over the dictation over the types of fabric that it is, and obviously the count that it would come in. So again, it's a case of go to somewhere like so-and-so or you can't go so-and-so, it's shut. Go to Lakeside Needlecrafts or Chromatic Alchemy or 123 Stitch or anywhere else where you can source your fabrics. And if you go into the fabrics, it will tell you the name, and then it will tell you the sizes of the counts that it does in that size or in that brand. So it is basically a brand more than anything. But you can have different brands that do, say, a 25 count. So okay, I don't know if your house is like my house, but it's like the M25 in here. I've got people coming and going like no tomorrow. So I do apologise if there's lots of noise, but it's starting to get to the point that I'm never going to get this video done if I keep stopping every time someone walks in this room. So fingers crossed the peace and quiet will happen. Won't it, Lauren?
Absolutely.
Absolutely, she says. Okay, so where was we? So Flo Stevens says, in picking out the fabric, does it matter what brand name of fabric it is? For instance, I'm able to find an 18 Ada with a grid line at 123 Stitch, and it's made by Witchell. And I also found some fabric on Etsy, not sure of the brand. Do you recommend one brand over another? I personally, when it comes to the gridded fabric, don't really have a preference. I tend to have more of a supplier preference. So Lakeside Needlecrafts and Chromatic Alchemy are my favourite places to go to get my fabric. But that's not to say that I won't go somewhere else to get my fabric. But I tend to find that a lot of the gridded fabrics it doesn't really make any difference to me what brand they are. One brand is very similar to another. Like I said, the only time I think it's a deal breaker is for the 25 count. The 25 count that's got the 20 by 20 square instead of the 10 by 10 square is softer to actually work on. But obviously I don't like the 20 by 20 grid line. I do like the 10 by 10 grid line. So, but as far as brands concerned, I don't really have a preference on brand. Obviously, most of the fabric that I have came from my Fabric of the Month club, which was with Chromatic Alchemy. And that was pretty much all 25 count Lugana. So yeah, basically some of the brand names, they only come in certain sizes anyway. So it's more dependent on what count you want rather than the brand. So I don't know if that answers the question, but hopefully it does. Hello Fudge, you want to come over now, don't you? Come on, over you come. This video is getting harder and harder to record. Okay, so other stuff that people have asked questions on. So after you've done with the cross stitching series, would you possibly consider doing an instructional video series on your drawn thread projects? I love the one you are doing, but have to admit I'm a bit intimidated at cut threads for the cloister blocks. I don't think I'm quite ready to sort of do any instructional videos for the drawn thread just yet, or for the Hardanger stuff. That's not to say that I can't do some stitch with me videos with the projects. There goes the front door. Like I said, this video is turning into a nightmare. Okay, I think we might not be disturbed anymore, hopefully. Maybe if I do a few more of them with a bit more practice, I will do something on that lines, since as you've asked me. But I'm far from experienced. I mean, I'm a lot more experienced in what I'm doing now with the Heaven and Earths, because I've had 5 years of working with full coverage. In fact, I think we're nearly at 6 years now. So yeah, so maybe one day. So what else? I've been stitching on kits on and off for 40 odd years and rarely had to use a second needle, only when the eye of the needle of one that broke that came with the kit. At the moment, I'm almost finished my second page of my first ever Hade, and I'm wondering if I need to change my needle at some point. Does it get sharper or rougher after a while so it is damaging the fabric, or do I just wait for it to break? Well, again, very much personal preference. I have to be honest, I'm probably the world's worst when it comes to needles. I tend to sort of carry on using a needle until I see it having, you know, if it starts to sort of feel like it's grating as it's going through the fabric, or it starts to shred your thread. If I start to see anything like that, then I will change my needle. But you shouldn't really need to change your needle unless you see something like that. I have to be honest, I'm not the sort of person that changes my needles too frequently. So, no, I don't think you do. I think you can just keep stitching with it until such time as, like you say, either something breaks on the needle, or you start to see, or if you start to feel it grating on the fabric, it's not going through quite in the same way that it normally would, or if you're finding that your thread's getting shredded, you know, it's sort of going a bit too fluffy and wearing the thread out, then I would change my needle under those circumstances. What else? The Hade had multiple pages. Do I start on page 1 and work my way through the pages? How do I know where to start stitching on the fabric? For that question, if you go back and look at the mini series, I do actually say, I think in video 5 or 4, where and how to work out where you start stitching on your fabric. We did cover that as part of the series. I always start on page 1. That's not to say that you have to start on page 1. Like I said before, for those that like to start in their bottom left hand corner or their bottom right hand corner, you would just need to sort of start on the page at the very end of the chart and work your way back up. But I personally start in my top left hand corner and then pick pages as I go. So completely personal preference as to where you start. But if you need to know how do you know where to start stitching on your fabric, I think at the very beginning of video or series number 5, I do actually show you on there how I work out where I start stitching on the fabric. What's next? A future idea. You don't have to do this. Maybe you can show us how to stitch on linen. For example, if I bought a mirabilia which is stitched on linen, how do you stitch on it? 2 over 2 with full cross. What count? It will be my next project. Okay. Maybe if I was to stitch on my mirabilia, I could show you how you stitch over 2 on linen and even weave. Of course, it is a video that I could do, you know, how I do my stitching on my mirabilias. Anything's possible. Thank you so much for the series. I'm a beginner. You showed parking with even weave. Would you do the same method with Ada? The problem with Ada is once you start stitching on it in Ada, then you have to continue stitching on it in Ada. And to be honest, Ada is no different to stitching on even weave. So the four holes that you see on this fabric, don't know if I can move you in. No, I'm already moved in. So the 4 holes that you can see on this fabric is exactly the same as the 4 holes that you would have on an Ada. Obviously, if I decide to do a project on an Ada, an 18 count or something along that lines, then of course I will show you how I do it on Ada. I noticed that you are stitching with both hands on a scroll frame. What kind of stand are you using? So I use a Millennium frame and stand. But before I had this frame and stand, I used to have a Lowry stand, which was just as good. And I didn't use these particular scrolls with it. I used sort of the cheaper ones that you can buy from sort of, you know, the normals, you know, 1, 2, 3 stitch in places. And obviously Q-snaps. So the Lowry stand is really good if you use Q-snaps. And then that way you can stitch two-handed. Next, thank you for taking the time to do this how-to series. I see a series on Hardanger in the future. You all keep saying that, and I don't think I'm experienced enough to be showing you how I do it, since as I'm probably far from an expert on it. And not actually done much of it myself. But that being said, the fact that so many of you have asked for one, I think I might have to sort of just at least show you how I do mine. Again, it is super easy. It's one of those things that once you've put some scissors to a bit of fabric once, it's not as bad as it looks. It was scary the first time. But yes, maybe in the future. Maybe in the future when I'm a bit more experienced at it myself, then I will have a go at doing one for you. I second the motion for Hardanger series. Okay, so there's a few of you that obviously want a Hardanger series. I get it. I'm hearing the call, people. I'll just have to do a bit more of it so I can practice. And I think this is the final question. It is the final question. So it says, parking finally makes sense. Does all this stopping and starting, especially marking, not slow down stitching? Cross-country stitching, cross-country stitcher here who's desperate to park. You mentioned you don't work with paper and use a program. Could you provide the details of the program, please? Also, could one video focus on your stand at all, please? Would love a demo of your stand. I will do a demonstration of my stand for you at some point and my little stitchy setup of how I do and what I do. As for the parking and the marking off, I find marking my chart on an iPad super quick, much easier than doing it on paper, if I'm honest. Whether you cross-country stitch or whether you use a parking method, the marking is no different. You have to mark to cross-country stitch and you have to mark for full coverage parking. The only difference is that I do it on an iPad with a little with this, and I find it so much easier because if I do make a mistake, I can rub it out. Whereas obviously when you've highlighted something, you can't unhighlighter it, unless of course you've got a friction pen and you're marking with a friction pen. That is it. We got there. It took 2 projects, about 4 different sittings of stitching to get it done, but I've managed to answer all of your questions, I believe. So thank you so much for all the lovely questions. I hope I've answered the questions and understood exactly what people wanted. I hear the call, people, for the demo of my stand, and I also hear the call that you want me to do stitching on even weave and linens for sort of, you know, stitching over 2. And of course I hear the Hardanger and drawn thread instruction request. I will see what I can do for you. It may be something that comes again in the future at some point, but that's not to say that I won't do one sooner rather than later. I just think, given that Hardanger and drawn thread I'm still very much a learner at, it might be worth me spending a bit more time stitching it and doing it myself before I try and explain to you how to do it. That said, maybe me being such a beginner might make it so that I talk you through it in layman terms the way I'm doing it because I'm so new at it. I don't know. But let's see. Let's see what happens in the future. But thank you so much for sticking with me and for, you know, all the beautiful comments. So pleased that the mini series has actually been something that everyone, you know, has benefited from. I wasn't too sure when I started the series of whether it was actually worth posting it up, whether it would be of interest to anyone. So the response that I've had has been outstanding, and yeah, and the comments have been really quite heartwarming and very heartfelt. So thank you so much. On that note, I now need to go off and do some housework. Hopefully I will get to do my floss tube update video in the coming couple of days, because where are we? Yeah, it's gone the end of September, so I'm a bit late with it, but I thought this video needed to go first, since as I did promise everyone that I'd answer your comments. So thank you so much, and bye bye for now.